A second issue that surfaces regularly in the practice of supervision relates to the exercise of authority. Now, authority is one that needs structures and relationships, and not only relationships of support and accountability that can be crucial, but at the same time, there is skepticism related and reflected in some people's personification of authority. Usually it's about the structures and the persons that hold power and authority. So the question is, who has authority? How is it to be exercised in a supervisory relationship? What are its limits? What theological assumptions inform the supervisor's exercise of authority? What are our shared understanding about the goal and purpose of supervision? To what end does the church confer authority? What are our shared understandings about the different roles and responsibilities within the church, and what authority is granted with these functions? These are just a few of the questions that lie below the surface of apparent resistance to supervision. These questions regarding authority cannot be addressed apart from the consideration of the church's theology and polity. The church's theology and polity have significant implications for how it confers and practices supervisory authority. The United Methodist polity, for instance, the tradition I'm a part of, that some of you are as well, creates supervisory relationships in which authority is asymmetrical. So the exercise of authority in these asymmetrical relationships appears to be a major contributing factor to the suspicion and fear that characterizes current attitudes about supervision. So gaining clarity about the purpose of authority and the appropriate exercise of authority within a community that is both hierarchical and covenantal is critical for the church's ministry of supervision. The third issue around supervision, and perhaps the one that is least noticed, has to do with the status of supervision in the church's life and ministry. People strongly suggest that supervision is viewed as ancillary to ministry. Whether persons think there is too much or too little supervision in the church, whether they judge it to be practiced well or poorly, our practice reflects an assumption that supervision has little to do with the continuing formation of persons or with growth in ministry effectiveness. Rather, it's something that has to be done either to satisfy an external requirement or to manage personnel. In either case, supervision is set over and against ministry. In other words, it's viewed not as ministry, but as a way of getting real ministry done, as a way of managing personnel. So there needs to be theological reflection on the church's practice of supervision, which is urgently needed to be addressed. The issues of trust and authority and the status of supervision in the church's life and ministry. A faithful and effective ministry of supervision must be grounded in our beliefs about God and the mission of the church and the nature of ministry. The suspicion and confusion that surrounds supervision in the church is due in large part to a lack of theological grounding of our practice. Without a clear articulation of our theology of supervision, there's no basis upon which to establish a direction and purpose for our practice. There's no standard for examining our faithfulness and effectiveness. Without a sense of purpose, it's not possible to have shared priorities and goals or to establish trusting relationships for accountability and support. It's interesting. Wesley's understanding of sanctification is a place to begin theological reflection on the practice of supervision. What would a practice of supervision look like if it were aligned with a theology of sanctification? How might such a practice enable persons and communities to embody more fully the image of God? What new possibilities open us up to when supervision is built on this theological premise? A journey into perfect love, Wesley spoke about salvation as a continual and progressive process of transformation brought about through God's prevenient grace, justifying grace, and sanctifying grace. The United Methodist Book of Discipline describes our Wesleyan belief in sanctification and perfection is this: we hold that the wonder of God's acceptance and pardon does not end God's saving work, which continues to nurture our growth in grace. Through the power of the Holy Spirit, we are enabled to increase in the knowledge and love of God and love for our neighbor. Theodore Runyon captures this purpose and goal of this dynamic process when he says, God not only justifies, thereby providing the foundation for the new life, but opens up hither unimaginable possibilities for growth and grace. God's goal is to create us anew, to transform us, to restore us to health and to our role as the image of God.